Hello there, everyone. This is Tracy Koch, and I'm lecturing on Chapter 8 out of the textbook. It's Family History and Pedigree Construction. This is a pretty important part of our course, since you're going to be expected to construct a pedigree a couple of times throughout the semester, and also to interpret some of the pedigrees that you'll see throughout the text and in some of the case studies. So by pedigree, we mean the visual organization of a family history, and you might recognize some of this when you see it as we're pulling up some of these slides. But getting a family history is a really easy and affordable way to start your genetic screening of a client. The family history must be updated on a regular basis because we know it changes frequently, and it should be collected from more than one family member because everyone has a little bit different story to tell. And you might get some vital information from one family member that you wouldn't get from someone else. So in the Essentials of Baccalaureate Education for Professional Nursing Practice that's put out by the regulating bodies, it requires that all BSN grads can construct a 3-generation pedigree with standardized symbols and terminology, which is what I hope you get from today's lecture. So in working with clients and looking at risk stratifications for a genetics referral, we want to determine whether an individual is at high, moderate, or low risk for developing a certain genetic disorder. There are certain red flags that would make us think about genetics referral for certain patients or persons that we work with. We like to use mnemonics in medicine, and it's no different for this course. One of the mnemonics, it's listed in your textbook on page 154, actually they're both there. But the one I'm going to go over first is the SCREEN acronym, and SC stands for some concern. And that's, do you have any diseases or any concerns about diseases that might run in your family? This is a good question to ask when you're taking a family history. Or, you know, one type of cancer diagnosis that seems to show up in a lot of family members. Those are good questions to ask when you're doing a screening for familial diseases. R stands for reproduction. Have you had any complicated pregnancies or birth defects? The first E is about early disease or death. Has anyone died suddenly or became sick at a young age? Ethnicity is your second E, and N stands for non-genetic, so any other risk factors that the family might have. But nurses can provide this screening and referrals to genetic counseling, but an actual genetics counselor is somebody who's a professional trained in that field. So you wouldn't be expected to provide any heavy-duty genetics counseling, just more or less identifying some risk and doing that referral. Moving on to the next slide, this is the mnemonic, another mnemonic for thinking about a genetics referral. The F is for family history, so if you have multiple affected siblings or individuals in a family or multiple generations that have a certain disorder, this would prompt you to do a genetics referral. And this is part of the value in doing a 3-generation pedigree, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the lecture. G stands for the group of congenital anomalies that you might see within a certain family. E is early onset. N is a developmental delay. So in a pediatric group, a developmental delay oftentimes carries a high risk for genetic disorder. Also, early onset dementia in an adult might raise some suspicion for a genetic anomaly or a suspicion for a referral to a geneticist. E stands for the unusual tissue histology, extreme or exceptional tissue pathology. So, like an acoustic neuroma, multiple colon polyps, or some other type of histological finding that might prompt you to think about something genetic. And S is a surprising laboratory value, so someone who's otherwise healthy that might have an extremely high cholesterol or bilirubin level, those would prompt you to think about a genetic referral. So pedigrees are constructed from, like I said, a standardized group of symbols, and the symbols are a graphic illustration, and it shows the member and their position within a family and certain medical histories. It offers us a view of multiple generations, and the symbols are located in a glossary in the back of your textbook, or you can find them online if you just Google pedigree symbols. You'll get the standardized group of symbols that we use when we're looking at pedigrees. Basics are that circles represent women, squares represent men, and lines depict relationships. So here we have an example of a very basic two-generation pedigree. The horizontal lines connecting indicate a mating, and the vertical lines are those of descent, or those connecting the offspring to the couple who have mated. The symbol for all children are drawn from the same line, so you can see that there in this basic example. In this example, this is a mother who had a child with a man who's now deceased, and then 3 children with her current partner, so that's what that pedigree would look like. The other thing we can do with a pedigree is some color coding and indicating different traits or multiple traits within a single person in the pedigree. This is indicated in your legend that's shown at the bottom of the slide here. So useful pedigrees should include at least 3 generations, use Roman numerals for the generations, use Arabic numbers from left to right for each individual in the generation. So here's a couple of examples we'll go through. This is a 3-generation correctly numbered pedigree. The proband is the particular subject or person that's being studied, so this would be the patient or the client that's working with you, and that's indicated with the red arrow. So because different ethnicities have different genetic risks, we want to be sure to include that in your pedigree. You want to sign and date your pedigree and work in pencil so that you can make changes as needed, and always indicate the proband or the subject. We're going to talk a little bit about Punnett squares, which I think most of us might remember from high school biology class, but those are diagrams that are used to determine risk of offspring being affected by a certain genetic disorder. Known parental carrier status and trait transmission pattern can show up in a Punnett square. We use the uppercase to indicate the dominant allele, and the lowercase indicates the recessive allele. A homozygote is the 2 letters of the same allele, and a heterozygous would be 1 of each, so a capital and a small lowercase letter would represent the heterozygote. Remember that Punnett squares represent genotypes and not phenotypes, so it doesn't necessarily predict illness, because that might depend on penetrance of the disease or whether or not a trait is likely to result in a lost pregnancy. But they are useful for basic genotype identification. So here's an example of a Punnett square, and this should look pretty familiar to most of you, and you can see that the probability of each pregnancy resulting in a certain genotype would be 25% for the dominant and 25% for the recessive, and then of course the heterozygous would be 50%. So in a recessive trait like cystic fibrosis, this is what your Punnett square would look like. The affected child would have the 2 lowercase b's, and the risk that an unaffected child would be a carrier would be 2/3 or 2 out of 3. So remember that these work for standard Mendelian patterns, and it doesn't really work for disorders that are real complicating, because variations in dominance can make it kind of confusing. So this is for basic Mendelian or standard Mendelian patterns. So we're going to move on to pedigree analyses. So all relevant information that's been collected and recorded in your pedigree, you can test the pedigree against possible interpretations looking for autosomal dominant, recessive, X-linked disorders just by looking at your pedigree. If you want to discard all hypotheses that don't fit your pedigree, and if you have one that remains, that can be your working idea. If you have more than one that remains, you pick the one that would be most likely. In this pedigree, we see that the males are represented by squares, females represented by circles. A diagonal line through number 1 in the first generation indicates a deceased person. A vertical line indicates a connection between parents and offspring. Your proband is the red arrow, and mating is represented by a solid horizontal relationship line, males on the left. And there's the sibling line is between siblings connecting them. In this pedigree, person 4 in generation 2 was adopted into the family. So you see the dotted line there. There's no biological relationship, but there is a social connection. And in this pedigree, person 4 in generation 2 was adopted out of the family. So this is a person that no longer lives with them, but there is that biological relationship there. And that's indicated with that symbol. Twins are indicated, as you can see in generation 2 of both of these pedigrees. The one on the left is dizygotic, and the other on the right is monozygotic. And you can see that connection at the uppermost of the triangle there, indicating that on the right-hand side. A pregnancy loss is indicated with a smaller symbol. If the sex of the embryo is unknown or the fetus is unknown, then it's a diamond or a triangle. This is an indication of partners that are related biologically by blood. And that's how you would show that on a pedigree with the double lines between the two individuals. So these are a couple of examples that are also included in your textbook in the end of the chapter with an answer key, and you can see that this example is of an autosomal dominant trait. It occurs in every generation, and you can see it affects males and females at the same frequency. So there are some other examples in your textbook that I would encourage you to go through and look at. There is a case study that we're including as part of the assignments for this chapter. And if you have questions, please feel free to let us know. And thanks for your attention.